Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome back to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and I'm up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. This week we are continuing our examination of the Fall of Cthulhu, a 6-part graphic novel series that deals with all kinds of cosmic shenanigans in multiple ways. And as I mentioned, this week we're handling part 4, which is known as Godwar. The writer is still Michael Allen Nelson. The artists are Matthias Santaluco and Mark Dos Santos, and the colorists are Eduardo Medeiros, Renata Ficini, and Digicore Studios, and the letterer is Marshall Dillon. Now, as I mentioned in the past before, I'm not as familiar with comic books as I am maybe with video games or, movies or books and whatnot, so I find it interesting to see the rotation of artists and letterers and colorists, but in having come full circle as we get the halfway through here and toward the end of the series, that they do repeat artists, and I'm wondering if this is intentional based on the art styles, because there are certain things that certain artists do that I think work very well for that point in the series. We had talked, I think, last week about how the dream sequence with the masked mute, the one that they call Mary, how the art, when it's from her point of view, is very different than the art surrounding it, and how the art of the Dreamlands is different than the very realistic and kind of gritty art that is used to depict the waking world scenes. So, in jumping into the plot here and how it relates to cosmic horror, we have a return to Cy Morgan, who you may remember from the very first set of comics. Cy Morgan is completely insane. He was stuck in Harlot's box and it broke him because, again, and we're going to get into this a little bit later in the episode, knowledge is both a godlike power in this series and also an incredible burden. But we have this almost seamless transition between one to the other. Cy Morgan is currently in an asylum, and the harlot basically calls in a favor. She wants Lucifer to bust Cy out of the asylum. Now, a lot of the stuff that the harlot does and has done for the past three issues are things that we don't necessarily see we're not seeing the forethought, because we are not the keeper of secrets, okay? What we are seeing is just almost a seemingly random series of requests and demands that she makes. But we come to find in this issue, and especially the next issue, that she has a plan. So she wants Lucifer to bust Cy out of the asylum, and when Lucifer asks, well, how is it that you want me to do that? She said, just think of it as a theft. Just steal him out of the asylum. Now, one of the primary cosmic horror themes in this particular set of comics, in this particular part, is madness, because Cy is clearly broken by his encounters with Nyarlathotep. But unlike the effect of madness in Lovecraftian cosmic horror, where it's basically the culmination of a person's doom, Cy's madness makes him both weak to suggestion, but also impervious to some of the things that Nyarlathotep can do, because you can't keep breaking what's already broken. So he is, in a way, I guess, better suited in some respects to fighting Nyarlathotep than maybe somebody who has more to lose. We also see the outbreak of a plague as a result of the Gith. The Gith, you may remember, is one of the minions of Nyarlathotep. Now, there's something very comfortably cosmic horror, and fairly cosmic horror natural, I guess, about a plague, but it seems that it's mostly a modern extrapolation of exposure to something outside of the safe confines of our known universe. Lovecraft, for all his themes regarding the insignificance of the individual, only ever really chose to show human fragility precisely through the deterioration of an individual. As a single example of the overall destruction of humanity, if the pantheon that he's created, this pantheon of entities, remains unchecked. Whereas in this particular series, the plague we're not seeing its effect on individuals. We're seeing its mass destruction effect, as we do with the other abilities and powers that Nyarlathotep's minions are exerting on our real world. The chaos, essentially, that Nyarlathotep is spreading. Now, along those lines, we see something that's rarely truly experienced in Lovecraft's work, and it's one of the things I think that's really fun about this particular series, is an actual invasion of the first entities of the God War. We're actually seeing the God War coming to fruition. It starts with these fire frog-like things that are called gull frogs. And we learn that through the, classic visitation to the, Arkham University and their top scientists and, all the people who in Lovecraft stories go and fight these things because they're the only ones even remotely, prepared or qualified to handle such things. Because, and again, this is a Lovecraftian thing. It's not a reflection of my own personal beliefs, but you get the impression that Lovecraft's rural areas were populated by a bunch of yokels, maybe for whom education and reading was not in the forefront of their priorities, so that it was only the university people, the smart folks, that could really handle this kind of level of knowledge and understanding and have any chance of fighting it. Whereas in this series, which brings a lot of this into the modern day, everybody is baffled. Everybody is just baffled. The university people, though, they do have some information, that they've gleaned from books and not so much personal experience, but mostly from their studies of language and history and theology and philosophy and etc. But it's really our little set of heroes here that has the personal experience to fight these things. Of course, in the aftermath of these cosmic shenanigans, we have Sheriff Dirk. He becomes reunited with Lucy and Cy. He was the one who initially interrogated Cy after the death of Jordan, his Cy's fiancé. And of course, he and Lucy have become friends. They've become pretty close over the last couple of issues. Now, in addition to the spreading of the plagues, we have Mary spreading homicidal madness through song and dance. And here's something I wanted to explore a little bit. There's a suggestion, in, for example, the short story, The Music of Eric Zahn, that music, has almost an otherworldly kind of power, that it has a power to transcend humanity, that it has a power to, basically, that it can basically, infiltrate various spheres of existence, that it has almost the same kind of, ethereal quality as a dream. And I think it's interesting that this agent of chaos, this masked mute, who, and we discussed the significance of masks and faces and identity, in prior issues with her, that perhaps the only true expression, the only understanding of her is, this idea of music, of singing and dancing. And, if you look throughout history, particularly with other mythologies and other legends of, naturalism versus supernaturalism, things that we've covered that are almost loosely related to cosmic horror, like the idea of the fairy folk who cause people to dance until they go insane. the idea of some fairy tales where the punishment is to have the person dance until they fall down dead. The tarantula in Italy, the plague that broke out of people dancing until they just fell exhausted. So there's this idea of song and dance. And what Mary does is she tackles a concert. Like one of those, almost like a Woodstock kind of, out in the open air concert type things. And basically, wreaks destruction there with song and dance. There's also an interesting conversation between Nyarlathotep and Sisyphix, one of his, I guess, his like top generals in this little group of minions that he has. And it's about watching the news. And this, I think, is another, iteration of the theme regarding knowledge. Okay. Because they're watching the news, and Sisyphix thinks of this, of him watching the news, as almost a downfall of his character, that, she calls it the gossiping of insects. But for reasons that he doesn't immediately explain, he finds it affirming. He finds, these reports of the devastation that he through his, minions, is causing, to be sort of affirming of his status and his power. Now, this could be his connection to humanity. He's one of the few, elder gods that actually does interact with humanity on a regular basis. And, as we know from any kind of scientific principle about, interaction, that you change, and you change the thing that you interact with every time you interact with something. Now, it mirrors a lot this idea, too, that, and what he does, I guess, imply, although he never really states it, is that, the gossiping of insects, as she puts it, is a lot like the whispers utilized by the harlot, that it's a form of knowledge. And as we've come to see, knowledge here is the ultimate power. It's also the ultimate punishment, but, that it's through whispers and through these little bits of knowledge that the world can be changed. And that's a consistent and important theme throughout this series. And the interesting thing here is that it's almost the antithesis of a lot of, Lovecraftian ultimate themes here, that, knowledge is the ultimate destruction. And here it's like, it carries with it a significant burden, as a lot of cosmic horror does. This idea that once you know, you can't unknow it. But it's also a very powerful weapon to wield. Now, of course, all of Nyarlathotep's minions have had these, they've had their sort of fun in the sun here, and Sisyphix wants to know when it's her turn. Well, she's a shapeshifter, so, what Nyarlathotep has her do is to, shapeshift into Jordan. And, there's a lot of, as I mentioned, these gods know a lot of what's going to happen before it happens. Not everything, but they do know a lot of what's going to happen, and they know that ultimately our heroes are going to confront him, strangely enough, at his house. There's the one part of the comic I didn't really understand. And I think it's because they let Sai make this decision that he wanted to confront Nyarlathotep. But the problem is, he's Nyarlathotep. I mean, I'm not sure what they thought that they were going to accomplish by this, but they go to confront him at his own house. And of course, Nyarlathotep said, because Sai says, you have no more power over me. You can't break me anymore. My mind is already broken. And his answer to that is to dangle the one thing in Sai's face that he still is powerless against, and that's his guilt and his love for Jordan. We also discover, in this particular episode, that the Necronomicon has a new story in it, a new page in it. And it's something that, during his captivity, that Abdul el-Hazred, who has been resurrected from the dead, that he has basically carved into Sai. So the Necronomicon is now this book written by a madman that features madness and destruction of, epic proportions, Sai is now a part of that. He is now physically and figuratively both a part of this machine. And that this particular chapter that was carved into him is about the Fall of Cthulhu. So, of course, this ultimately leads to a convergence of the gods and their armies and their minions and I heard the best pronunciation. I've heard so many people pronounce Riley, in various and sundry ways, but in listening to some, audiobook the other day, I heard somebody pronounce it as Riley, and the way it's spelled, that makes the most sense. So we're gonna go with that, and I apologize. I've always pronounced it as Riley, which is not right at all. But that's how, you get an idea stuck in your head, and that's kind of how you see it. But, Relais sounds, based on the way it's spelled, that sounds the most, accurate, but I apologize to the scholars out there who know if there is a better and more accurate, pronunciation for the word. So, we have this convergence at Relais. We see Nodens. We see an attempt at summoning Cthulhu. This is why Abdul al-Hazred has been resurrected, because he can read the passages from his own book, which would allow the summoning of Cthulhu. And what we also see is Nyarlathotep's true form. So there's a lot of story happening here, as opposed to on some of the past sections where it was more of the building of one character, the building of a concept, or the gathering of something. Now we're starting to see, the gears of this machine of war really starting to turn. And we see the beginnings of the battle, which leads us into part 5. Now, this week we are also covering part 5. We're nearing the end of the year, and I would like to have this series wrapped up so we can start new stuff in January. So I'm going to tackle part 5 as well, and then we'll tackle part 6 next week, which will be fairly short, because it's really kind of just a prelude and an epilogue, more or less, to the story. So part 5 is called Apocalypse, and it's aptly named. The story, again, is by Michael Allen Nelson. The art is by Mateus Santaluco. Colors are Eduardo Medeiros and Mateus Santaluco, and the letterer is Marshall Dillon. And I mention this because I've noticed now that there is sort of a coming full circle of people and their art styles being utilized in a particular way. I'm not sure if that was intentional. I'm not sure if it's ever intentional in comics. Maybe it is sometimes. Maybe, if it can be organized that way. But if it's not intentional, then it's kind of a happy accident, because the art that they do for the chapters that they do within these sections, it works out pretty well. Now, in part 5, we have sort of the culmination of this God War. And one of the ways that this reflects a cosmic horror aspect that we don't generally see in Lovecraft's work, because Lovecraft usually stops it before this happens, is that the monsters take on their true forms, and they actually do emerge in this world as who they really are. I don't know if Lovecraft was afraid to go that far in his work, or if he just thought that the true horror was the threat hanging over the heads of humanity that this could happen. But we see here an actual attempt, and I know that in modern cosmic horror, there's often an attempt to really sort of explore what the nature of that threat would mean if it got even closer to fruition than Lovecraft ever really went. In this particular case, it's an interesting categorization of the personalities of these creatures. It used to be, and I know that we've talked about this in episodes before, it used to be that in Lovecraft's work, the monsters themselves, part of what made them scary was the idea that they were so alien to us that we couldn't understand their motivations. We couldn't understand their ways of thinking. And to an extent, I think that's important. Even if we do see, the things they do or hear the things they say, even if they pontificate about their own opinions of things, we're not always going to understand everything that all of their reasoning behind everything that they're doing and saying, because they're not like us. They don't think like us. They don't have the same morals, and they don't have the same physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual restraints that we do. So there may be, things that seem incongruous or things that seem contradictory. It's one of the reasons why I've always believed that it's very difficult to effectively write about something like, say, God or the devil or, any kind of like elder god from the elder god's point of view, because I think that we fall prey to characterizing them in human terms. Of course we do, because, as human beings, this is the lens through which we see the world. But I don't know that they would accurately, I think really the most accurate portrayal of them would be something that, much in the way he describes them physically as being difficult for our eyes to really fully understand, their motivations and behavior would be really difficult for our brains to fully recognize and process. So, but we do see a certain humanity here. And again, I know I've excused this throughout this series because Nyarlathotep is one of the predominant entities that we're dealing with, and he does interact with humanity often enough that he probably has picked up certain human characteristics. The most prominent of those characteristics is posturing and boasting. And the way it reads in this issue, I have to admit, in having listened to Defender's dialogue, and having seen a number of comic book, adaptations in movies and cartoons and things like that, there's a certain comic book, banter during and before battles, which really only works in comic books. It's a little bit, I don't want to say hokey, but it's a little bit, melodramatic, maybe, like, hey, villain, I will take you down, I will vanquish you, and I will win. It's like that kind of chit chat. And I think that's a sort of storied, excuse the pun, traditional aspect of comic books. And we see that here. We see that, Nodens attacks Nyarlathotep. And Nyarlathotep is surprised. He's not worried about it. He's just sort of like, oh, this was about me? Oh, okay. And basically proceeds to kick Nodens' ass. He sends a portion of his army after Nodens' army, and Nodens, who is probably like the size of the Statue of Liberty, is still not really a match for Nyarlathotep in his true form. And that's, as I mentioned, that's kind of a primary aspect of this particular issue, is the idea that now that they are at the place they want to be, they are moving away from the human beings toward their own affairs. So their illusions and their manipulations and, really their attention on humanity at the moment is sort of losing hold. What we also see is Nyarlathotep's the plan the whole time, which was to tear a hole between worlds. Now, anybody who's listened to this show long enough or really knows me at all knows that I love the idea of alternate dimensions and the creatures therein, and particularly the idea of dreamland dimensions or things like that where reality and physics is just completely different. Nyarlathotep's plan is to tear a hole between reality and the dreamlands precisely because it loosens the hold that people have on what's real and what's not. It's also because Nyarlathotep's army happens to be stationed in the dreamlands, and because it sort of solidifies his power across both realms. Now, Nodens has a stake in the dreamlands, as does the harlot, so they're not completely overrun by Nyarlathotep and his armies, but this would move significantly toward his being able to conquer both lands, basically. So now we have not just the gods about to butt heads, but we have all of their armies of night gaunts and weird-looking creatures and Cthulhuoid-type creatures coming up out of Relais and stuff like that. We have all of the minions and the cultists devoted feverishly, slavishly to these gods, clashing as well. And in the middle of this, we have basically these three human beings. And what I like about this is that we have humans outwitting them, which is also something that we didn't really see in traditional Lovecraftian work. In modern horror, and in traditional Lovecraftian work, that was really because it was an emphasis on the idea that the individual is sort of powerless, and that not only is the individual powerless, but as a society of individuals, we're powerless and really basically insignificant in these insurmountable odds. But modern cosmic horror takes that a step further. Even if that's true in reality, it is not how we frame our existence. We find significance in the insignificant. We find purpose in the hopeless. It is, well, I suppose nihilists don't, but for the most part, humanity looks for a reason to get up in the morning. And they look for people who make life worth getting up in the morning for. So we see human beings, despite the fact that the odds are wildly stacked against them, using the one thing that humans are good at. And that's, this sort of art of being human, really. We see, for example, the final, because at a certain point, Sisyphix is, she has to keep fighting Cthulhu's minions. In order to do that, she has to revert to her own shape. And basically she bites heads off of things and she tears things apart. And Sai is still kind of confused. At one point you sort of want to smack him upside the head and say, like, can't you see what's going on here? But he wants so badly to believe that Sisyphix is really Jordan that he sort of glosses over the fact that every time she tells him, turn your head, don't look at this, and he turns back, she's in the process of reverting to Jordan again. But we start to see even that, like, that hold on him is starting to weaken because somewhere deep in his mind, he knows this is not really Jordan. Jordan's dead. He saw her dead. And whatever this creature is, she's sounding less and less and less like somebody who loves him and more like somebody who's using him. Ultimately, it's Sheriff Dirk who dispatches her because the one ability she has is to understand who you want her to be and to replicate that person. But the problem, or maybe the solution, is that the harlot's removal of the knowledge of Sheriff Dirk's wife allows him, actually, this specific gap in his memory is what allows him to see Sisyphix for what she is and to ultimately destroy her. So we come to find that it wasn't a bad thing that the harlot did, that in this particular case, as difficult as it is to lose that bit of knowledge that made life worth living, that made it worth getting up in the morning, in this particular case, it saved his life. That he couldn't remember her meant that he had no hesitation in pushing her right off a bridge and into, the churning waters below. We also see Sai's purpose revealed. And here's an interesting cosmic horror. It may be the most cosmic horror-y aspect of this cosmic horror series. Sai's purpose, Nyarlathotep, we find, is not, as he says to Nodens, he's not like Cthulhu. He's not like these other gods. He's not like Nodens, He's not one of the old ones. He's an elder god who is in service to the outer gods. Now, the outer gods, if I understand the mythos correctly, are the biggest and brightest and maybe the most dangerous of all the elder gods. And these are the ones that were banished to the most faraway places, or not banished, I guess, but these are the ones that exist the farthest outside of our universe. Because any real interaction with them, they're almost like the primordial sources of things. They're that big and that powerful and that ultimately forces of nature. These would be like the black holes, or the supernovas, of the universe here. And one of these, the one that Nyarlathotep works for, is Azathoth. And I always thought Azathoth was kind of cool. In most depictions, he's like this big, he's like a big mass of eyes and tentacles and other kinds of creepy stuff. But in his court, in Azathoth's court, is a book. And it is basically a book of, I believe they call it a book of, forgetting. But it's a book of chaos, basically. And anyone whose name is in there is, brought to Azathoth's attention, which is something humanity doesn't want. It would be, and I know I've used this analogy before in other episodes, it would be like if you, turned a black hole in our direction. Okay? We know a black hole's out there. We know it's dangerous, but we don't interact with it. It's not close enough to us to do any damage to us. But if it was just a little bit closer, if it was just tilted maybe a little bit in our direction, if it could just shift, however many light years toward us, it could wreak absolute and utter destruction on our whole solar system. The outer gods are like that. Okay. So you don't really want to bring to their attention that we even exist. But Nyarlathotep's plan is to have Sai be transferred to this court so that he can sign his name in this book, which would then bring Azathoth's attention to humanity and allow Nyarlathotep to sow chaos there, because that is what he is. He's essentially an agent of chaos, who I guess needs Azathoth's permission or Azathoth's backing in order to fully destroy a place. Maybe he, I don't know, siphons off some of that power to do it. It's not really very clear. But we know that this would be a very, very bad thing. It is kind of the ultimate, and again, we don't need to know all the details. We don't need to know, all the hard facts of it, because it is, again, the plan of a god. So if it is beyond human understanding or comprehension, that's probably the way it's supposed to be. But it would bring unfathomable chaos if Azathoth's attention was drawn to humanity. So now we see Lucifer facing down some of the lesser gods. She manages to wrestle the Necronomicon away from Abdul Alhazred and prevent his continuation of the summoning of Cthulhu by happening to mention in front of these Cthulhuoid creatures that this new chapter that Alhazred wrote was about the Fall of Cthulhu. Now, if we've learned anything in this series, it's that Cthulhu's followers, his cultists and his creature followers, etc., are very much go Team Cthulhu, and anybody who has a problem with that, they attack. And that's what they do to Alhazred, and she manages to get the Necronomicon away from him because of that. So now she has the book. She also faces down Mary, the masked mute, strangely enough, by using one of her discarded masks. Every time Mary communicates an emotion or a thought or feeling, she takes off one mask to reveal another underneath. Whatever her true face is, as we said, we don't know. It may very well be that there isn't a true face under there, that it is basically just the void of starless space under all those masks, that ultimately she's a black hole of her own. But the masks she keeps very carefully guarded, over whatever must be her true face or lack thereof. And they have significance. The masks have significance. As far as we're aware, those masks are displaying an emotion or a thought or a feeling or an idea that we only get, strangely enough, because part of being a human being is learning from the time that we're babies what human expression looks like, particularly facial expression. We understand a smile means that a person's happy with us. We understand a frown means a person is sad. Tears mean a person is sad. Angry eyebrows means that the person is angry. You know, we come to learn these little tricks. So whatever Mary is communicating, we are filtering through the idea of human facial expression. Now, this is not, we come to learn, how she recognizes those same qualities in a face. Because when Lucifer puts on one of her discarded masks, and it's of this hideously grinning monster, basically, it terrifies Mary, and she flees back to the place where she came from. So, whatever the significance and the communicated message of that image is to her, again, we're not privy to that level of depth, that level of profundity in communication. But it must mean something more than just a scary mask. We also see Sheriff Dirk taking down the Gunruk. I never pronounced that right. That's the big bat-like creature that the little boy had become. And that's basically a devourer. It's a devourer kind of creature. And he had come back because Dirk had killed Sisyphix, his mother. So, there's a battle there. Dirk takes him down. And then we see, in the showdown between Nyarlathotep and Nodens, Nyarlathotep wins. I mean, there was kind of there was really no question there. We knew that was going to happen. But then we see the real showdown. And that's between the harlot and Nyarlathotep, where the last battle was all about brawn and strength. This is all about brains and wit. The harlot doesn't have the same kinds of powers that Nyarlathotep does. And yet she has the upper hand almost the whole time. I mean, he beats the crap out of her because he's angry. He smacks her around a lot, but, she never loses her composure. She never loses her cool, because we find out that she has intercepted Sai before he go to the court of Azathoth and has told him not to sign his own name, but to sign Nyarlathotep's true name, his secret name, which Sai has learned, as he has learned all things, in one of Harlot's boxes. It's why the harlot put him in a box to begin with. Now, granted, she knew it would break him, but the gods are not concerned about these little things. Once again, knowledge becomes a weapon as well as a detriment. And it is this knowledge that the harlot uses to undermine Nyarlathotep's plan. Because in putting Nyarlathotep's name in this book instead of his own name, it's going to force Azathoth to summon Nyarlathotep back again. So he is going to be banished back to the court of Azathoth for the time being. While if he has to leave, this is going to cause that rift between the dream world and our world to shrink and ultimately close again, because he won't be there to keep it open. And his armies, which managed to defeat Nodin's armies, are still somewhat depleted. So Harlot brings through her own army to fight. So basically, on all fronts, Nyarlathotep's butt is getting kicked all over the place. Of course, it wouldn't be a cosmic horror without some type of cult interference, and certainly wouldn't be a Lovecraftian story without somebody somewhere reading a spell to close this doorway. And that's exactly what Dirk and Lucifer have to do. They have to sacrifice. They have to make a sacrifice, which they choose to make one of the followers of Cthulhu, one of the cultists. And Lucifer, who understands how to read the Necronomicon because of her prior work, she reads the spell that ultimately makes the city of Relais sink. Now, the last, I think, interesting thing to mention in this particular this section of the series is, I had mentioned early on that there's a little girl, a little red-haired girl, who appears in various panels randomly from the first section on. Who she is never explained, Sometimes she's in the background. Sometimes she's in the foreground while the real action you're supposed to be paying attention to is in the background. But we have no idea who she is until this moment. When Lucifer goes to check on the harlot, who is injured, but okay, they have this discussion about how the harlot the harlot only uses the boxes on men, so she's not going to put Lucifer in the box, even though she and Lucifer don't really get along too well. But what she does do, again, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably both, because every step of the way, everything that the harlot has done for anybody has been both. It has been as bad as it is good. But Lucifer goes there because when the harlot cursed her with knowledge of everything, she can't sleep. She has nightmares because all she can see is all the horrors that these gods have done throughout history and over and over and over again. And it's, she can't sleep. She can't function. She wants the harlot to take it away. The harlot won't do that for her. What she does instead is she introduces her to this little girl who has been sort of pervasive throughout this whole section. And although we're never told who the little girl is, we are told what she does. She is the one who has created the harlot. She is the one who has ultimately been pulling the strings the whole time. We could say maybe she is an agent of balance. If Nyarlathotep is an agent of chaos, she is perhaps an agent of balance. This doesn't make her a good guy or a bad guy, but it allows her to keep things as they are. And we find out that Harlot had once been a human being. Now, her life prior to being the Keeper of Secrets is no longer relevant, so we don't get it. But what we do find out is the one thing she can't do for herself is produce an heir. And that is what this little creature, this little girl, does, is that she marks Lucifer as Harlot's heir, which is why the harlot won't take away all those memories. The next Keeper of Secrets, when the harlot dies or passes out of this role, Lucifer will become the next Keeper of Secrets. What I like here too, if we're going to go back to the art for a second, is that you see it in the physical change. In most depictions of Lucifer throughout the different sections, even with different artists, she's a pretty girl. She's dark haired, dark eyed, nice little figure. Like she's a pretty girl. But you're seeing subtle changes here. Now her eyes look wild. Her skin is discolored. It's almost gray instead of, the usual, flesh color, her usual flesh color. And it's really depicted in the subtle changes in the art. She's not unattractive, but she's clearly been transformed in some way. What she does, though, as we said, that a lot of the point of modern cosmic horror is the idea of a reason to get up in the morning. And when we see Sheriff Dirk in these last few scenes, his reason to get up in the morning is gone. He has seen so much ugliness. He's a cop. He's seen the worst that humanity has to offer, and there really is nothing else for him. There's nothing else for him to want to do, to want to be, until Lucifer returns one final time and says, but there is a reason to keep going. There is a reason. And she gives him back his memories of his wife. It's the one thing she bargained from the harlot in exchange for being the heir. The one thing she managed to get her way on was that she was able to, as the new Keeper of Secrets in training, it becomes her information to give, and she gives back his memories of his wife. And that is sections 4 and 5. Next week we'll do section 6, and then we'll be done for the year. So thanks again for listening. If you like this, or if you want to listen to the other show that I am a co-host on, the Horror Show with Brian Keene, you can find these episodes on Project Entertainment Network, iHeartRadio, iTunes, which I believe is now Apple Apple Radio, I think. All places where other podcasts are listened to and other shenanigans are engaged in. We want to especially thank Matt Willison, who's been engineering for us while Dave has been convalescing. You can check out his podcast, Grindcast. You can also check out his new short story collection, which is full of cosmic horror goodness, Horrors Untold. That's available now on Amazon, I believe, and on Amazon. Go find it. Go check it out. It's really awesome. Okay, so thank you, and I'll see you next week. Bye.
How do people who make stuff up for a living make stuff up?
New York Times bestseller Jonathan Mayberry told us.
Oprah's book club favorite Sue Miller told us.
You sort of take a character and make some bad things happen.
How'd we get them to do that?
We collared them, just like at a cocktail party, except through your headphones.
Join us every Thursday for the Liars Club Oddcast.
A slightly unhinged podcast where storytellers interview other storytellers.
Available on Project Entertainment Network, iTunes, and everywhere podcasts are heard.